4 armed robbers entered a bank in Argentina and took hostages. The police surrounded the place, and after several hours of negotiation, the robbers announced that they would surrender on the condition that the police give them a pizza. The pizza arrived, but the robbers suddenly cut off all communication with the police. The police decided to break into the bank, but when they entered they found no one but the hostages, and when they went downstairs, they discovered that the bank's vault had been looted, leaving no trace of the robbers and no trace of the way they had escaped. There was no hole in the ground, and there was no exit from which they could have escaped. The police immediately turned to the hostages, suspecting that the robbers were hiding among them. But were the robbers really hiding among the hostages, and where exactly did they go? That's what we find out in today's story. Hello and welcome. In 2006, the largest bank robbery in Argentina was carried out. The operation was incredibly clever and complex. The robbers who carried out this operation were 4. The first leader was Fernando Araujo. The second was the engineer of the operation named Sebastian. The third was called Beto de la Torre and earned the title of financier. And the fourth was known as Louis and earned the nickname Violence. There were also 2 other people who assisted them from the outside, but their identities have not been revealed. The first had the title of doctor, and the second had the title of boy. Please remember the names of these 4. The story begins with Fernando, the leader and mastermind of the operation. This man walked into a psychiatrist one day and said, "I want to rob a bank." The doctor was surprised and thought that he might be talking under the influence of weed, because Fernando smoked and used weed constantly. The doctor said, "Okay, where did this desire come from? Do you need money?" Fernando replied, "No, I don't need money, but I'm an artistic person, I love art, and I feel I can create a great work of art in the field of bank robbery." The doctor said, "Okay, and how do you plan to carry out the operation?" Fernando replied, "I don't know now, but this subject dominates my every thought and aspect of my being. I think about it before I sleep, after I wake up, and every moment of my daily life. I want to rob a bank." At that moment, the doctor didn't give much weight to his words, feeling that it was the cannabis that was doing the talking. But in fact, Fernando was indeed sincere in his intention to rob the bank and carry out the most clever robbery in Argentine history. At that time, Fernando was on a daily basis scouting the streets of Buenos Aires, Argentina's capital, for potential targets. He happened to find a bank called Banco Rio, one of the well-known banks located in a very wealthy area, where wealthy people store their wealth, money, and valuables. Fernando spent time thinking of ways in which they could carry out the operation. The first method involved entering the bank when it was open, stealing money from the tellers, and then making a quick exit before the police caught up with them. However, this method was extremely dangerous and unprofitable due to the lack of time to reach the vault and steal the money. The second method involved breaking into the bank when it was closed, but this process usually required digging an underground tunnel to the vault. However, there was an issue that this method could be quickly detected due to the bank's alarms and thermal sensors. Both methods are difficult and high risk for Fernando, and he thought if he's going to take the risk anyway, he should at least get the bigger payoff, which means he's going to do the second method, dig a tunnel and get into the vault while the bank is closed. He started thinking about how he could dig a tunnel first. He thought about renting an apartment or a warehouse near the bank and digging a tunnel to the vault from underground. But in the end, Fernando got a sweet surprise that would shortcut all this work. One day while he was doing reconnaissance. During his reconnaissance, he noticed manholes along the street in front of the bank. Approximately every 10 meters there was a manhole, which meant that there was a pre-existing underground tunnel that ran in front of the bank, the sewer tunnel. Fernando followed these manholes along the street until he reached the mouth of the sewer. The outfall was a large manhole about 150 meters from the bank, which meant he had found a ready-made tunnel. Fernando entered this drainage tunnel and began to explore it. At first, the tunnel was square, but after walking a short distance, about 100 meters, he came to a circular tunnel, about 6 meters in diameter, which meant it was a huge tunnel that ran under the city and passed right in front of the bank. Now, Fernando needed someone to help him because there was no way he could do it on his own. The first person who came to mind was one of his friends, whose name was Sebastian Polster, and we nicknamed him the Engineer, because this man was an expert in electronics and mechanics. When Fernando went to him with the idea, Sebastian was surprised because Fernando had no criminal record and no experience in robbery cases. All he knew about him was that he loved art and cannabis. How could someone like that plan to rob a bank? However, Fernando started telling him the details and the idea he had in mind and how they could access the vault through the underground sewer tunnel. Here, Sebastian began to think seriously about it, even though he had never stolen anything in his life. But his family's past with banks was tragic. When Argentina's banking system collapsed at one point, much of their savings and money was lost without being paid back. Sebastian began to think of this as an attempt to reclaim their rights. Banks were the evil side of the equation, and if a bank was robbed, it wouldn't be immoral, at least from his point of view. Engineer Sebastian told Fernando that he was with him on the operation. So together they went to the location of the bank and the sewer tunnel underneath it. They started doing the math to figure out exactly where to dig. First, Fernando went and got measuring tapes and started inserting them into the drainage holes. These strips helped him so that when they entered the drainage tunnel, they knew exactly where they were and how far they were from the surface. Then they went inside the bank and secretly took a bunch of photos, pretending to be new customers, and went down to the bank's vault in the basement to look at them. They got an estimate of how big it was and how many safety deposit boxes it had. There were hundreds of safety deposit boxes, but even with all these estimated calculations, everything was based on estimation. They didn't have exact numbers, so they had to get accurate maps of the bank building, which would most likely be available at the municipality. They realized that they needed help from people with experience in the world of robberies, and on top of that, they needed financial support because the tools that Sebastian the engineer would make would need money. Fernando, the leader, started looking for a new partner to join them. He reached out to someone they called the Doctor, who never revealed his identity and was more of a liaison than a partner in the operation. The Doctor told Fernando that he would connect them with the right people to help them with the operation. The first person was Beto de la Torre, whom we called the financier. Beto was a former gangster, and although he had no direct experience in robberies, he had experience in the world of weapons. The leader Fernando and the Doctor met with him to explain the idea, and Beto was eager to join them as soon as he heard the details. Fernando asked, "Do you have the ability to finance the operation?" He answered, "I don't have cash, but I have a truck that I can sell and use the money to finance the operation." Beto thus became the third key member of the gang. The Doctor, as we said, is anonymous, and we didn't consider him a key member because he didn't actually participate in the operation. Importantly, the leader Fernando wanted a fourth person, someone to work with him on the manual labor that required strength, because engineer Sebastian would be busy making tools. Beto, the financier, was the oldest and slow-moving, so he wasn't enough. The Doctor suggested the fourth person to join the gang, Luis Silanes, whom they nicknamed the Violent One. Luis was a gangster with a history of robberies. He had a lot of experience in robberies. He had done a lot of operations, and was imprisoned for 15 years in one of the toughest prisons, Luis the Violent. He was one hot-blooded and always ready for violence at any moment. With all this, he was smart and had skills in acting and fraud, and this will play an important role in the operation. Now the gang was complete. Fernando the leader, Sebastian the engineer, Beto the financier, and Luis the Violent. These four started looking into the details of the operation, and together they went down to the sewer tunnel, where they saw the place and saw the calculations made by Fernando and Sebastian. Now, as we said, they needed more accurate calculations. They needed the blueprints of the bank building. Luis the Violent said, "I'll get you those blueprints." They asked him, "How?" He replied, "I'll get them." A few days later, he brought them and put them in front of them, and to this day they don't know how he got them, whether by bribery or personally broke into the building and stole them. After that, they were able to calculate things accurately, determine the location of the tunnel, and draw a detailed plan with all the calculations needed for the digging process. They brought in a diesel generator, drilling tools and large drills, and someone was always watching from up on the street to make sure the sound of drilling didn't reach outside the sewers. This digging process would take at least several months, and then they would have to solve the next issue, the thermal sensors and alarms that would go off as soon as they broke into the vault. Fernando, the leader, due to his artistic background, began to formulate an idea for a suit that would hide their heat from the sensors, suggesting a suit made from sleeping bags used for camping and mountaineering. He bought a thermal camera and started experimenting with it to see if it would be able to capture their body heat. However, the idea was somewhat terrifying, as there was a chance that the suit would fail, especially with the need to move around inside the closet extensively. They also had many tools and objects inside the closet that could be picked up by the sensors, making the idea completely unsafe and high risk. The leader Fernando was frustrated by this and was always thinking about the best safe way to get into the vault. Suddenly, he had a crazy idea, thinking all the time about robbing the bank while it was closed. That is, they could enter the vault from underneath without being seen, and he ruled out the idea of using a gun to break into the bank because the police would quickly surround the place. The new idea he came up with was to combine the two methods, digging the tunnel and breaking into the bank. They would use the tunnel they had dug to get out, and that way the sensors and alarms wouldn't matter. The police would have already surrounded the place, but only from the outside, not realizing that the robbers would escape from underground. When Fernando came up with this idea, he started searching online to see if anyone had done a similar operation before, and found no trace of it in history. This was to make sure the police wouldn't anticipate an escape route. When Fernando went and told the gang the idea, everyone was amazed and excited. Now they had to add weapons to the equipment they would need, and Beto, the financier, said he would take care of the weapons, being a gangster and having experience in this area. But remember that the weapons they will use will have something special, which we won't reveal until the end of the story, so stay tuned and follow the story to the end to find out what it is. The process took about a year overall. During this time, they completed the tunnel and built a small dam inside the sewer tunnel, and the purpose of the dam was to raise the water level to a certain level, because they were going to use small rubber boats inside the tunnel. They knew that when they came out with the booty, they wouldn't be able to carry it on their feet, and half of their bodies would be submerged in water, and it would be very slow moving. So they had to use boats. They built this dam so that the water level would be high inside the tunnel and allow the boats to move easily. They discussed an escape route, and the initial idea was to escape downstream and get out of the tunnel. But then, they said no. There was a high likelihood that the police would head downstream when they realized the situation, possibly blocking the road. So they started studying the second method, which was the opposite direction of the estuary, and they discovered that this direction was much better because it had hundreds of exits. These exits were the manholes along the tunnel, and they were located every 10 meters. After studying the opposite direction, they identified a particular manhole they would exit from, and this manhole was about 200 meters from the bank's location. They then decided to bring a van and park it directly above the manhole. In the floor of the van, they would open a hatch, and this hatch would be directly above the manhole, allowing them to exit the manhole directly into the car without being seen. The financier Beto brought in a van and put it in his garage. The gang gathered in the garage to modify the van and cut a hole in its floor. While they were working, Beto the financier's wife walked in, and they all became agitated and went over to Beto, demanding an answer as to why his wife was here. He said, "No, it's fine. Don't worry. I trust her. Believe me, it's perfectly fine." This was the first and only time the gang members met Beto's wife. Remember this woman, she will play an important role in the story. Now that the gang has finished modifying the van, they have to look for a driver. It's the turn of the second unknown person, the one they nicknamed the Boy. This person, whose identity, like the doctor's, was never known, was responsible for driving the car and waiting for them to finish the process. Everything was almost ready. The only thing that remained was the need for a way to quickly open the safe deposit boxes inside the vault. Inside the vault there are hundreds of boxes, and they can't open them manually, otherwise it would take too long. So, engineer Sebastian built a hydraulic tool that they called a cannon. The function of this tool is to break the locks of the safe deposit boxes in just 7 seconds per box, making it a vital tool in the process. Finally, after all these preparations and efforts, everything was finally ready. As you can see, this is the sewage tunnel that they will enter by boat. This is the tunnel they dug that leads to the above-ground bank. And this is the bank vault, with the safety deposit boxes in the basement of the bank building. About 200 meters away, this is the manhole that they're going to come out of. Above it is the open-floor van that they will use to escape. The gang decided to carry out the operation on January 13, 2006. The engineer Sebastian was the only one who entered from the tunnel in the sewage system, and next to the tunnel hole they had dug were the small rubber boats with the tools. Sebastian. Then he went up through the dug tunnel until he reached the bank wall behind the vault, and sat there waiting for a signal from his colleagues. His colleagues, leader Fernando, financier Beto, and Luis, gathered in front of the bank door. Once they were sure that everything was ready and everyone was in place, they stormed into the bank with their guns drawn. They immediately took the customers and employees who were inside the bank hostage and ordered them to lie on the floor. The bank guard locked the door and alerted the police, and it only took moments for police patrols that were close to the bank to arrive. At this time, Fernando began to implement a plan he had previously formulated, which he called Plan El Coco. The idea was to take one of the hostages, walk out the door of the bank and appear to be trying to escape, only to return quickly after seeing the police surround the place. They even placed a dummy car in front of the bank from the door to appear as a getaway car. But due to the speedy arrival of the police, their plan failed. Now they were trapped inside the bank, and this ruse was so successful that when the police chief arrived on the scene, the police who were present told him that the robbers had tried to escape through the door, but quickly returned to the bank when they saw that they were trapped. Here the police chief assumed that the robbers were trapped and had no other way out, and the robbers inside the bank were in control of the situation. Except for one thing, the guard who had locked himself in the surveillance room. They needed to get him out of that room somehow, because he was in direct contact with the police. If the guard saw the robbers coming out of the bank, he would inform the police and their plan would fail. So they made attempts to negotiate with the guard, and the violent Louis told him that he would not be harmed if he opened the door, otherwise things would get worse. The guard refused and emphasized that he would not turn himself in no matter what they did. At this time, violent Louis took one of the female employees and put the gun to her head, threatening to kill her if he didn't come out. The guard stood his ground and refused to surrender, but the employee he was holding started crying. This was bad for the guard, because he knew and worked with the employee, and the employee started begging and crying and asking him to come out. She said she wanted to see her daughter again. Here, the guard couldn't ignore the situation and her crying, so the violent Louis said, "Okay, I'll come out, but don't hurt anyone." The guard then opened the door, put his gun on the table, and surrendered himself to the robbers. Violent Louis then searched him and took his phone, then told him to move in front of him and escorted him toward the entrance of the bank. When the guard asked in surprise, "Shall I walk out the door?" Louis said yes, and the guard walked out the door with his hands up and went rounding the place. The police chief asked the guard about the situation inside the bank, and the guard told him that he saw 3 armed robbers holding about 30 hostages inside the bank and that they had taken his phone. Through the windows of the bank, the police chief saw one of the robbers, masked and holding a phone in his hand, pointing at them from the outside, as if asking them to call the phone. At the same time, the leader Fernando was communicating with engineer Sebastian, who was waiting outside the bank in the tunnel, and told him to start digging the wall. Sebastian then heard a sound of movement on the other side, and it was the sound of Fernando moving a chest of drawers that was exactly where Sebastian was digging from. After the hole opened and Sebastian poked his head out, Fernando took a long breath of relief as he was now confident that they were connected to the bank. It was a moment of fear for him because he feared that they had dug in the wrong place. Engineer Sebastian entered the vault with the hydraulic tool and began to use it to open the safety deposit boxes, of which there were an enormous number. The plan was to take a certain amount of time to open the boxes. They had set themselves a 2-hour window. During this time, they had to open as many boxes as possible, and they expected to be able to open about 400 boxes in those 2 hours. In the vault, engineer Sebastian and Fernando continued to carry out the looting, while violent Luis and Beto the financier kept control of the hostages, trying to stall the police until the predetermined 2-hour time limit expired. Louis the Violent was the man on the phone, and this man, as I said, had a talent for acting and deception, brilliantly succeeded in delaying the police and creating a celebrity even in the media that regularly covered the event. They called him the man in the gray suit. Even the police chief, when he called him, was amazed at how calmly and easily this person spoke to them, as if nothing had happened. The police chief asked him, "What are your demands? What do you want?" The violent Luis replied bluntly, "We went in to rob the bank, and we intended to escape quickly. But you detained us. You were faster than we expected. We don't want to hurt anyone, but now we don't know what to do." The policeman sat watching the violent Luis through binoculars from the bank window as he talked to him on the phone, seeing that he was sitting in a chair and relaxed, as if he didn't care about anything, and he was wondering how this man could be so calm. That's when he realized that the man in front of him was an expert with a criminal record. Indeed, the violent Luis interrupted his thoughts and said, "Look, my friend, I just got out of Sarachica prison after serving 15 years, and this is not my first robbery. I mean, I know your procedures and tricks. I advise you not to try to play games with me, because this could lead to something bad for the hostages." The officer replied, Okay, don't worry. We won't do anything. Just release a hostage every once in a while to show us your goodwill," he replied. "We just released the guard for you. Why are you being so greedy? Remember, greed is not good. Don't ask for hostages. We decide when to release hostages. Got it? Okay. Bye." He hung up the phone like that, showing the police chief that he is the master here and making him think 1,000 times before making any rash move. And that was all they needed. Time. One of the funny things that happened was that Louis the Violent and Beto the Financier, who were with the hostages, discovered that there was an old woman among the hostages, and it was her birthday. So they went to the little kitchenette attached to the bank and brought her a little cake. And they sat and sang happy birthday to her, and had all the hostages lying on the floor singing to her. At the end, they told her that they were going to give her a birthday present, that they were going to let her go, and they walked her out the door and let her go. This story is reported by several sources, but as strange as it is, even I can't believe it. Anyway, the communication between the violent Luis and the police chief continued, and each time Luis invented a new story or something new to distract them. On one occasion, he told them to call his lawyer to negotiate the terms of their surrender, and gave them a phone number belonging to one of the hostages as the lawyer's number. When the police called the number, Luis himself answered and changed his voice to sound like a lawyer, telling them he was on his way to negotiate the terms of surrender. This guy was so clever, he managed to stall the police with ease, and was able to stall them for the 2 hours they needed and had set for the operation. When the 2 hours were up, unfortunately, engineer Sebastian and the leader Fernando were unable to open the number of boxes they were targeting. They only managed to open 147 boxes. The hydraulic tool they were using was having issues and overheating, making it difficult for it to work as efficiently as expected. Nevertheless, they managed to get a large haul, which was enough for them and more, so they decided not to take any more risks and stick to the time they had set for themselves without letting greed blind them. Leader Fernando called the Luis and told him that they were going to start the plan to escape from the bank. Here, Luis would use the last trick they were hiding for last against the police. He called the police chief and told them that they decided to turn themselves in, but knew that they would be in custody without saturated food for a long time. Before turning themselves in, they wanted pizza, so they made it a condition for the police to provide a large enough number of pizzas for them and the hostages. The police chief replied, "Okay, we'll get you pizza." Luis stipulated that the pizza had to be authentic Italian, and gave them the specific name of a restaurant far away from the bank to delay its arrival as much as possible. The police chief replied, "Okay, we'll get it from this restaurant." Luis then cut off all communication with the police. He and Beto, who were upstairs, ordered the hostages to lie on the floor without any movement and threatened to shoot them immediately if any of them moved. Meanwhile, Fernando and Sebastian, who were in the vault below, collected all the loot in bags and threw it through the tunnel they had dug. Luis and Beto joined them in the vault quickly, and before they came out, they laid a small towel on the floor and put their guns on it. We will later learn the reason behind this move. Then, as they were coming out of the hole in the wall, they repositioned the chest of drawers that was on the wall to cover the hole again, and on top of that, they placed something that looked like a bomb on the hole. After that, they quickly went down to the small rubber boats that were waiting for them below, and put the bags on one of the boats. Then, they got into the second boat. The boats were tied to a rope, and they went straight through the sewer tunnel, until they reached the hole they would exit through. They took the bags of loot with them, and climbed up the ladder, where the van and its driver were waiting for them. They entered the bags through the hole in the floor of the van, which was barely big enough for them with the large amount of bags they were carrying. They drove off unseen, then headed toward the safe house they had prepared in advance. When they arrived at the safe house, they put the van in the garage and unloaded the bags of loot. The first thing they did was turn on the TV to watch the news and see if the police were following them. The funny thing was that the police hadn't broken into the bank yet, so they smiled as they watched the TV as if they were watching a movie, and waited for the reactions after the police found out what they had done. While the police chief was trying to communicate with Luis, who had ordered a pizza, there was no response, so the chief decided it was time to break in. He ordered Special Forces soldiers to enter, ready for an armed confrontation. But when they burst in, all they found were the hostages lying on the floor. Because the robbers, before leaving, had hidden the hole in the wall, the police could not understand where they were and how they had escaped, assuming that the robbers had somehow hidden themselves among the hostages. When the hostages came out of the bank, they took them out as detainees until they could confirm their identities. The footage you see here is real. Finally, after a period of breaking, they discovered the opening behind the chest of drawers. But the next issue was that there was something that looked like a bomb in front of them. So they had to call in the bomb squad to check it out. They then realized that it was just a fake bomb. All this was happening while the gang was sitting comfortably at home, watching TV and celebrating their victory. Then, without counting, they divided the loot among themselves, just by sight, because counting takes a long time. Their spoils was a small mountain, a mountain of money, gold, and jewelry. The bank estimated that the loot amounted to $19 million. The operation was categorized as the largest bank robbery in Argentina's history. After dividing the loot between them, the plan was for everyone to go their separate ways, never to see each other again. So everyone set off with their share, got in their cars and headed in their direction. Of course they were happy, but someone's joy was quickly spoiled, and the others started following him one by one. That person was Beto, the financier. When Beto returned home, his children and his wife Elysia were eagerly awaiting him. Elysia, who was mentioned earlier, knew about the operation, so she was excitedly waiting for her husband, waiting for their new wealth that would change their lives forever. Beto celebrated with a big party that night with his wife and children. Time passed, and one day when Beto returned home after a tour with some friends, he noticed that one of the sacks of loot they had been hiding in the house's safe had been moved, and when he opened the sack, he discovered that a large wad of money was gone. He went to his wife Elysia and asked her, "Tell me, did you take any of this money?" His wife replied coldly, "Yes, I took 5 or 6 small bags with me. Imagine, 5 small bags containing about $300,000. Beto told her, "We are trying to avoid attention. How can you take an amount that big without telling me? You will expose us." He demanded that she return the money she had taken. His wife refused and the dispute escalated. In the end, Beto took his loot and the bags he had at home and decided to hide it somewhere else. What he never expected was that his wife would be so envious of him that, as soon as he left the house, she went to the police station and reported him. Perhaps she believed he was cheating on her with another woman and thought he had taken the money to go to his secret mistress and hide them there. Imagine that jealousy was the reason for their arrest. Although there was no such thing, because Beto didn't have a mistress, he loved his family, and it was impossible for him to go anywhere without them. There are many details of the events that happened afterward, but we won't go into them in detail because they are not important. In short, Beto was arrested, and during his interrogation, he refused to reveal the identities of his colleagues. But thanks to his wife's help and some other clues like phone tracking, they were eventually able to identify the 4 who carried out the operation. Arrest warrants were issued for all of them, and although each of them went to a different destination, they were all caught. For example, Fernando the leader was hiding in a tent in the middle of nowhere, but National Guard patrols succeeded in capturing him. Luis the Violent left Argentina and was caught in Uruguay, and Sebastian the engineer was caught in his home. All 4 were arrested and prosecuted. Interestingly, most of the loot was never recovered, as the thieves hid it in difficult places and refused to admit where it was. In the end, they were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 9 to 15 years. but none of them completed their entire sentence. On the contrary, they were all released at short intervals as a result of their good behavior. Fernando and Sebastian spent only about 2 years in prison and were released to house arrest for 2 years. Beto and Luis, because of their criminal records, served longer, with Luis serving about 6 years and Beto about 8 years, far less than the length of their already light sentence. The main reason is the weapons they used. Remember when I told you that there was something special about their weapons? Remember also when I told you that when they left the bank, they clearly put their weapons on a towel? The reason is that their weapons were fake and not real. Imagine that they went in and carried out a huge operation like this, taking hostages and confronting the police and special forces with fake weapons. Of course, the reason is that if they were caught, which they were, the sentencing for an armed robbery is very different from an unarmed robbery. This is what ultimately led to light sentences and early release. But the strange thing is that most of the loot was not recovered, and I don't know if there was a secret deal with the authorities to recover a large part of the money in exchange for early release. Otherwise, it would be very strange to release them for nothing. The only possibility that remains is that there were bribes involved, but these are just assumptions and we don't know what happened behind the scenes. The bank's customers were of course compensated by the bank and the insurance companies. There is a dramatic movie about the case, and also a documentary. In the documentary, the 4 of them brag about their operation and appear to be living their lives normally, still comfortable. I didn't know exactly what happened with the money. That's the end of our story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and activate the bell button. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Bye.